Welcome to the online launch of Settling the World by M. John Harrison. Here's the book right here. Sorry, it's a bit dark. Published by Comma Press and hosted by the wonderful people at Housmans Books. To quickly introduce myself, my name's Gary Budden. I'm a writer, editor, and I'm the co-founder of the independent publisher Influx Press. And I'm the host for this evening's event. So before we start, I'm going to give Mike a bit of an introduction. The structure is fairly standard if you remember physical events in the real world. I'm going to give an intro. Mike's going to give a reading from the book, from one of his stories. We're going to be having a bit of a chat, a bit of a conversation about the collection. And then we'll have about 10-15 minutes for questions from you guys. So there is a Q&A function in Zoom. So if people can think about what questions they might like to ask, you can put them in the Q&A function nearer the end, and then we can read through them and answer your questions. So hopefully that will make sense. Okay. So I just want to give Mike a bit of an introduction for anyone here who isn't aware of his work. M. John Harrison is considered one of the most important stylists of modern fantasy and sci-fi working today. But I would also say we could call it speculative fiction, or weird fiction, or all manner of other sort of slipstream genres, perhaps, but we'll come back to that point. A pioneer of the new wave, he's the author of books such as The Viraconium Sequence, Climbers, The Course of the Heart, Light, and the recently published The Sunken Land Begins to Rise Again, as well as many collections of short fiction, including, I think this is the second one now with comma, so there was You Should Come With Me Now, published a few years ago, and this new one, Settling the World. This is a selection of short stories drawn from 50 years of writing. That's 1970 to 2020. These are stories that follow backstreet occultists, amateur philosophers, down and outs, and refugees. And Mike's writing has always defied easy categorisation. And I've taken this bit from the blurb of the book. Whoever wrote it, I think, did a great job kind of encapsulating your sort of writing style, building worlds both unreal and all too real, overlapping and interlocking with each other. His stories are full of portals into parallel dimensions, unidentified countries and lost lands, and places that may never have existed. But more important than the places are the people who believe in them, the characters who spend their lives hunting for and haunted by clues and maps that speak to the possibility of somewhere else. So, Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you to give a reading from Settling the World.
Okay, thanks a lot. This should take about 10 minutes. It's a whole story called Landlocked, which was written for a collection called Seen From Here, edited by Tim Etchells and Vlad Horvat, which is still available as a PDF from Unstable Object, all proceeds going to the Trussell Food Bank Trust. There's no evil in the story, only loss and confusion. Palinurus the navigator fell off the boat and forgot his signature skill. Panic attacks, anxiety attacks, and depressive episodes followed. You don't ask a builder, he remembered trying to explain to someone, if an arch is the truth about something. That isn't the point. For a moment before sunset, light levels were distributed strangely across the landscape so that the coastal hills seemed closer than the house. You can either build an arch or you can't. After that, he drove from town to town up the coast, deteriorating all the way, and no one heard from him again. Her journey was literally at right angles to his. Though she had never learned to drive, she found that after she had eaten a cab driver, it came easily to her, along with the local language. She left not long after him, heading north, following the steady rise of the land. But while the navigator clung to the coast, always keeping the sea to the left, she headed for the interior, seeking out middle-class landscapes with simple founding assumptions. A glass of wine in the evening, a toddler on the patio in the fading light, people waiting unexpectedly to find themselves in their real lives, or unexpectedly trying to outlive the wrong lives all of their lives. Often she found them surrounded by a detritus of their own acts of abjection, symbolized in collections of rediscovered personal possessions from which they felt alienated. They often remarked that they wondered why they had these objects. Meanwhile, she kept a geranium in a pot in the back of the car, reached behind her now and then while driving to crush a leaf. Palinurus had two repeating dreams. In the first, as he went overboard, the water had an ugly look, dark and speedy, but also with something to it of stagnant harbours, scenes you might find yourself in when you are already dead. Shallow in places, black mud banks in static water with a cream of chemicals all over, overlooked by shipping containers, a viscidness, a meniscus full of petroleum rainbows and bobbing fecal matter, bent cans, plastics large and small, small islands of ruderal scrub, whole dead animals with slick fur and no eyes. Like that one minute anyway, but the next changing direction to accelerate and rush past, and then grey and waveless, bowed tight at the surface, here and there pulsing like the worst currents, the big cold rips and eddies of a body of true coastal water carry you off into the night. That moment, felled by the tiller, woken so abruptly from one nightmare to the next, Palinurus knew he'd had it. And yet he hadn't, and through luck and coincidence, made it somehow to the shore. That was the unexpected thing about it all, he reported. It wasn't by any means the end. She felt some sort of relief to be out of the salt sea, but a life on land had no credibility as far as she was concerned. It was just something to laugh about. Meanwhile, she could see that he was still not sure he hadn't, in fact, died. Their conversations from then on were frequent, but always brief. She might sit with her feet in a half-filled bucket of water and her shoulders in the sunlight from the window, asking him about the things she could see. From the outset, he had left her to her own devices in the evening, while he went from bar to bar along the seafront, telling the story to old friends who didn't believe it. The rooms she stayed in during her drive inland were often full of a strong, old-fashioned scent she associated with the seafront barber shop. Although it might equally have been confectionery, it was on the edge between perfume and citrus. And also, since there was no one but her in the room, it seemed liminal in its actual nature, that is, both there and not there. A little later it was gone, and she would get up and walk about in a restless way, not exactly sniffing the air, but holding it in her nose and then breathing out slowly, lifting her head like an animal, bringing into play an olfactory organ human beings just don't have. Sometimes she thought she could still smell it, but more often she couldn't. Later, she would realize it was herself. Palinurus's second repeating dream was essentially one of movement. It was a relic. It was the bodily memory of another time, other levels of confidence and awareness. But given the slightest encouragement, it spilled out of the night and took him over as if it had been down there waiting since the accident. Understanding yourself, he thought, is always a meaningless joke. But sometimes you can't help wanting to make personal contact with who you are, or in this case, who you used to be. You get lost a few times, you give up. It's scary at first. That's when you remember that the dream has a lizard-like, ironic look in its eye. Shortly after falling off the boat, though, he had begun to feel liberated. I enjoyed it, he insisted, the final time they talked. In return, she asked him how much of that elation, that relief, was in fact a diversion. How much of his embrace of what he now called possibility was a covert replay of that final voyage. He said he didn't want to talk about that. Navigation was a broken process for him. He'd taken it up too early in life, and now he felt free. In the last room she took, they gave her a fruit that tasted like slightly sweetened rubber, which she ate slowly, keeping away the many small flies with one hand. A girl watched her carefully as she ate, her expressions changing as if she was eating it herself. Yum, said the girl, and we plant them every year, so they come up. This seemed too literal to mean anything. Why else would you plant something if not for it to come up? So instead of trying to answer, she looked out of the window at a man on a little tractor going up and down in the short sloping field before the house. He had a dog that ran about untiringly up and down the shallow furrows, which were dark to begin with, but dried out in minutes. It stopped at every corner to stand and stare around as if it had never stood there before. Alone in the room again, she found a glass bowl full of water and sunlight, throwing onto the wall every flickering, shimmering, debatable pattern she knew. Who had pulled who ashore? Who had rescued who? Given the situation, neither of them would ever be sure. The sea had had an ugly look that night, but there is no evil in the story, only a misunderstood gesture, the saturations of self-deception. He's dead, she's marooned. He never leaves his dream. She won't now ever leave the room. It's a comedy, a brief confusion, followed by both persons getting, in a sense, what they want. For instance, he often reassures himself as he travels the coast. To what degree does navigator only mean someone going somewhere? Well, she thinks, why do I love the light here so much? That's it.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Mike. So I was just looking at that again as you were reading through it, and I just noticed. So that's essentially a brand new story. It says 2020 on it.
Yeah.
So I think the obvious question going into this, before we sort of go into, I suppose, let's say the deeper stuff, is actually how and why you selected the stories for this book. Like I said in the introduction, it's covering a large span of time from 1970 to this year. So I just wanted to know what was your selection process for the book? How did you choose the book, the stories that make up this book? Is it supposed to be a greatest hits, or is it something different to that?
No, it's not. It's definitely not a greatest hits. I think I would have chosen a totally different set of stories for a greatest hits. Some of the obvious greatest hits are missing. This whole process is really difficult because even if you're trying to select for the best, the reader has a different idea of what the best stories are anyway. And so however hard you try, you always get somebody writing to you saying, but why did you leave out X? Why did you leave out Y? So it wasn't intended to be that. I selected a huge number of stories to start with. And Ra Page from comma then cut them down to what was basically practical in terms of page length. Otherwise it would have to have been, a doorstop. So that was basically the process. The process was I picked all the stories I liked, and Ra said, you can have that one, but you can't have that one.
So there was a lot of editorial input from Ra at Comma, is what we're saying.
Yeah. I think there was, plenty of to and froing with regard to what ended up there.
Yeah, and I'm just interested in that kind of process, because first of all, the stories are not chronological either. They in the terms of when they were published, they jump around in time, don't they? So you might read the story that you just read, and then we'll read a story that might have been published in the early 70s. Again, was that an intentional choice of yours? Was that an editorial decision from Compress, or? And I just wanted to know what the reasoning was for that.
That was a similar process. I produced them in chronological order, but Ra felt that a chronological order produced a kind of clumping of themes. I do, for better or worse, I return to themes again and again. And if you arrange the stories of 50 years along a chronological line, you do tend to see the repetitions tend to clump. So he decided that it would be a good idea to break that order up and to separate stories that had very similar themes. So that's why we did that.
That makes sense. I mean, so do you think there's almost like a through line to the collection if you read it from cover to cover? I'm one of those people who will, by and large, read a short story collection from beginning to end. I know other people do jump around and sort of choose stories that grab them. I do think the order of the stories is quite important. So I just wondered if you felt like there's a kind of unifying thread to the stories. Not
to the degree that I felt with You Should Come With Me Now. You Should Come With Me Now was structured to have that through line, to have a really powerful, distinctive through line, which would manage the themes in such a way that you could almost mistake it for an experimental novel, as it were. This isn't like that. This is essentially just a scatter of stories. They could have been presented in chronological order, or they could have been presented in a completely random order, and how you engage them is essentially up to you as the reader.
Okay, that's interesting. And I suppose the only other thing I was going to ask is that you had I guess you'd say a similar collection published in 2004, Things That Never Happen. I think some of the same stories are in that as this, but is this like simply an updating of that kind of idea in that collection, which again I think was selected stories, wasn't it, from throughout your career up till that point?
Yes and no. The part of the point of doing this one was that what Things That Never Happened left out was an entire collection of short stories that I'd produced in the 70s. I think there was maybe one story, maybe two stories from that collection, because essentially I never liked it very much. I never had a great deal of confidence in most of the material. That was called The Machine in Shaft 10 and other stories. And I was under a certain amount of pressure from readers to reprint that. But I didn't want to reprint the whole of it. So what I decided to do was select some stories from Things That Never Happen. Some stories from this earlier collection, and put in a few new ones at the end. There are three stories at the end which really haven't been. Most of the readers of this collection won't have read.
So that first early collection, the early collection, Machine in Shaft 10, has that never been reprinted?
No.
Has it? Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. And why didn't you want it reprinted as I suppose the argument would be as a kind of historical record of the writing at the time, but
for me it would be a historical record of my embarrassment. I think
But you did put stories from the collection into this one, so you can't be embarrassed with the entire thing.
Not with the entire thing, no. I was quite surprised at some of these. I like particularly the Causeway, for instance. I read the Causeway and was, oh, I could have written that last week. Curiously enough, since it's the earliest story in the whole thing. I did sort of enjoy reading it and think, well, you know, if I tweaked it in a couple of places, I could almost admit to its existence today. But there are other stories there. You know, I used to be so proud of Running Down. I can't read it anymore. It's awful. I find it absolutely awful. I just want to go through those sentences with a blue pencil and make it work properly, you know. So, you know, essentially Things That Never Happened was supposed to be a retrospective, but I left out part of the retrospection. So we made some attempt to change that for the better.
Okay, that's good. Well, yeah, because I've got a copy of Things That Never Happened. I was meant to dig it out, but I think it's, I'm in the middle of sort of moving, so I think it's packed in a box somewhere, which is a shame because I wanted to be a bit nerdy and compare the table of contents. But it's interesting what you said about the Causeway, which I think was I don't think I'd read that story before, but what you said there about it being very similar to something you could have written today is something I felt. I remember getting to the end of that story and seeing the date at which it was written, and I suppose being surprised in a good way at what I think is the kind of uniformity of, not uniformity, but your kind of vision of the world seems to be in place very early on. I don't know if you would agree with me there, because you like you were saying, you're less than happy with some earlier stories, but there does seem to be in the kind of ideas being expressed, the tone of the writing and the sort of eye for detail. I do feel that it's remarkable how like fully formed some of your work seems, like even in the early 70s.
I was surprised by that as well, to be honest. I was surprised. I was surprised in both directions by that. Some of the stuff that I remembered as being, as it were, still contemporary, as far as I was concerned, I found to be clunky and kind of off message. Whereas I did find the Causeway quite close to, especially in its interest in statelessness, for instance, to be, as you say, quite interestingly contemporary. I don't know whether this happens to everybody. You're always surprised. There are 2 or 3 stories in there. I think the Ice Monkey is in there. I remember the Ice Monkey is the first story that I got right, that I got correct, that I found the correct way to write those kinds of stories. I look at it now and it just seems like a pair of old boots. It's really clunky. And I look at it and think, crikey, Mike, you know.
So why did you want to include that in this collection? I'm a big fan of that story, The Ice Monkey. I think it's a brilliant story. So interesting to hear you describe it in that sense. But you like it enough, presumably, to have
oh, sure. It. Absolutely. And I still like it because it's the first story in which I swept out most of the generic material. In fact, almost all of the generic material. You know, it's a horror story with the horror technique, which had been an early experiment in that direction, and it succeeds. It does work. It's only the prose really that gives me nightmares when I think about it. I thought it was so clean, and it isn't. Yeah. Whether this happens, you know, whether this happens to you or to everybody or not, I don't know. I was talking to Chris Priest about this recently, and he's an inveterate rewriter of his early stuff. The moment he dislikes a thing, he's in there with the blue pencil and rewriting it. I do feel that to a degree you should leave the stuff as it was, because why should you betray your early self? Why should you, be ashamed of yourself, as it were? On the other hand, there are stories from back then that I simply wouldn't republish now. I wouldn't do it. Not necessarily because of their technical inability or their failure to do what I thought they were doing, but partly for political reasons. It was a different age, and we did different things. And I look at some of it now and think, no way.
What do you mean by that? The political reasons? I'm just curious.
I find that some of the attitudes that I had back then are just, I can't live with them anymore. It's as simple as that. There are attitudes which are
outdated, perhaps.
Outdated is a good word. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting to hear you say that.
We've all grown up, and having aged as well. Of course. I feel doubly sadly, I feel doubly grown up, and I wouldn't republish the stuff.
Sure. We've just got a question in the chat. Sorry, that was a weird bit of feedback there. Someone's asking, could you give any examples? If you'd be willing to give any example, anything you can
There's an old story that will never see light of day again, and I think the title explains everything, called The Orgasm Band. And, its content pretty well fits the title.
Okay, that makes sense. I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned there about the story of the ice monkey. This was, I think I'm paraphrasing here, about stripping out the generic elements of the story. You just described it essentially as a horror story with the horror elements removed. And I suppose this is something that I've always really responded to in your fiction. It's one of the aspects of it I like particularly. And I just wanted to pick up on this idea of how you focus on, well, I suppose your approach to genre, but how you write these stories that are set in a very real world, or as the blurb on the book puts it, a too real world. A lot of the fiction, The Ice Monkey is a good example. It has these almost hints at sort of fantastic elements or very mysterious aspects, but they're taking place in, I would say, very commonplace or sometimes even banal, almost exclusively British settings. And it does feel like what you're saying, you've sort of stripped out the kind of horror, the generic element of it, but then it's sort of left this kind of mystery in place. And that's not, I'm rambling a bit there, but I just wanted to know, firstly, why did you start doing that? Because The Ice Monkey is a good example there, that you're saying that's your first real attempt at doing it. And then I definitely feel you carried on there in stories like A Young Man's Journey to Viraconium and The Incalling and stories like that.
The idea was to leave just enough in to haunt a very realistic setting, so that the actual content or subject matter of the story was inserted in such a way as that it haunted the events rather than was directly observable and directly talked about in the story. It's not much difference from symbolism or imagism or any of those early modernist techniques. The idea was to remove the more obvious elements of the subject matter and let them emotionally haunt the reader, essentially. That was my first plan. Later on, I discovered that if you did it that way, you could flip them as contexts for one another, so that you could bring the fantasy back up and use it to recontext the real aspects, and then push it back out again, push it back down again, and go back to the normal procedure, which is to context of fantasy in the real. Now I play the quickest and slipperiest of games with that kind of tonal shift and register shift. I'll try and do it across a sentence, certainly across a couple of sentences. So there's this flicker going on all the time. You're never quite sure whether you're in a real world or a not real world. And both are real, you know, in terms of the perception of the characters of how they live or where they live or who they are. There is this constant flicker of epistemic uncertainty about who they are and what the world is, which seems to suit me.
I think that seems to suit the world in general, to be honest.
It gets to be a better and better description of the world we've got. That's for sure.
And I think that maybe that's where there's the description of the sort of two real settings for it, and that's something like I said, I respond to very, very much. This kind of a good example is the story Young Man's Journey to Viraconium, which is a story I love, and it was a real joy to reread that. And it's the kind of the focus I find on. I hope you'd agree with this on I don't banal, but not in a negative way, but the details of like small cafes in, where's it set in Greater Manchester, but then there's characters who they're kind of hoping to find this, essentially a portal to this other place, which you don't really explain within the story, Viraconium, and the alleged access point to this other reality that people seem to be yearning for is a bathroom mirror in the sort of downstairs toilet in a cafe somewhere in the kind of Greater Manchester area. And it is that kind of mixture of, I don't know, the kind of commonplace sort of everyday with this sort of fantastic element, but often the characters in your stories, they don't quite get there. And why is that?
That was a complex process as well. I felt from the very start, even as a reader, in fact, especially as a reader, and here I'm talking like 13 years old, that every story in which people went through a portal into a fantasy disappointed me in the extreme. As soon as I found out what the as it were, solution to the mystery was, two things happened. One was I lost interest in anything that happened after that. And the second is that nothing that was ever revealed to me by that kind of process seemed in any way interesting. It's as if the mystery is only interesting as a mystery, as far as I'm concerned. So that was the first reason I started to do that, was essentially to entertain myself.
Yeah.
And to make sure also that the reader was entertained, that I didn't lose the reader until the very last full stop of the story. But then I read some theory and I got into eco and realized that if you stop a story early and leave the reader not quite satisfied in terms of an explanation, that story has a good chance of living on in their head. That essentially, stories want to live, eco says, you know, they want to live. They don't want to die any more than we do. And one of the good ways to make a story live is to keep the reader thinking about it after they've finished it. So that was another reason. And the third reason was that at the time, in the late 70s, I was extremely angry with fantasy.
Yeah.
As a thing. I still am, actually, for that matter. I thought it was escapist. I thought it was extremely dangerous to be able to lose yourself like that in an invented world when you could be changing the real world. And so it became my intention to deliberately prevent the reader from having that experience, to bring the reader up to the point of the fantastic revelation. Yeah. And they say, no, you're not going to have that, because you can go back to the world you're trying to get away from and fix it, because that would be a better way of doing things.
Try and solve mystery in this world that we're in.
Well, not just try and solve the mystery, but why did you want to leave it in the first place? Why do we want to read escapist fiction, watch escapist movies? Because the world we're in isn't right.
Yeah.
You know? And if the world isn't right, you know, if the world's not right, you fix it. That's what politics is about. And I felt then quite strongly about it. I feel less strongly about it now, to be honest. But then I was a very angry person, and I felt very much that there was no possibility of fantasy being anything other than escape from the real problem, which was to fix the world. So there you go.
Okay. Well, I was going to pick up on that idea. There's something, I was reading your short story, The East, which I've read before, but I was reading it again today. When was that published? 1996. And The East is about this character who, an old man who may or may not, it's implied, be from sort of old communist Europe. And he's speaking to the narrator about countries in Europe like that don't seem to have ever existed. And he speaks of a place called Autotelia. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah. Autotelia.
And for some reason that word sort of went off in my head, and I was like, Autotelia is a concept. So I was just looked it up again. I looked it up again today, and it relates to art, doesn't it? An autotelic, it means something that has an end or a purpose in itself, which I think applies quite strongly to your fiction. Like, the mystery is the thing, is what we're saying. It's not leading you to some big revelation. The mystery is kind of the point. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah. Yep. I would say that. That story is interesting. Actually, it was published later than that. It wasn't published until in the late 90s, I think, that first Autotelia story. But it was the result of over-ambition in the early 70s. I had an idea in the early 70s to write a novel, which would have been a collection of short stories in which it slowly revealed that a brand new continent has appeared in the world.
Which is the sunken land, isn't it? The idea of the sunken land.
Yeah, it was based on Doggerland. We were reading the first material about Doggerland at the time, and I thought, as I think probably a lot of people did, oh wow, what a good idea! You know, there's there was a world under the water after all. You know, but I discovered that I didn't have the technical ability to do it the way I wanted to do it, or to do it as well as I wanted to do it. So I abandoned it after I'd written quite a lot of material. And eventually I turned those chapters, as it were, into the short stories that they'd started out as. And that was the first of them that I finished.
Which one, The East?
Yeah, The East was... The whole idea of the idea was that the stories would all be written differently, separately, and that they might not even mention the mysterious new continent. That the reader would have to like hammer those bits together as they read. And so in Autotelia, for instance, is clearly about a new continent, a new country, whereas the East played more games with that idea. Is, as you say, is the East actually Middle Europe? Is it Eastern Europe? I don't think it is. If you look up some of the names, they're quite obviously made up. In fact, I had the greatest fun of my life making up names that sounded as if they were for Eastern European.
Yeah, no, I like those. I've got the book in front of me, so places like Menkagrad, Zentny, Norosh, the Triangle, places like that, which I didn't look up. I assumed they were made up, but they sound like they could be real.
Some of them were made up, some of them weren't, and I was quite surprised which was which. And now I don't know. I've got no idea. I look at the story now and I think which of them did I invent?
Yeah, it just jumped out at me as something you do in your fiction. So they're kind of fictionalized places, such as Autotelia, and then in the light novels, you have the place Saudade, which again is the kind of the kind of Portuguese concept, isn't it, of a kind of form of an advanced form of nostalgia. I mean, there's not really an English translation of it. Just interesting to kind of places and concepts are kind of getting kind of conflated here, and I find that very, very interesting. There is a bit from the East that really jumped out at me today, and especially in the way you're describing how you write and your decisions to write. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read it very quickly.
Okay.
This is the narrator talking about the old man who might be from Eastern Europe, who might be from Autotelia. He says, his English was very good indeed. There was never any doubt about his English, but the story he told had such a skewed feel. It was like a bad translation, full of innuendos just where you wanted clarity. The language he couched it in was good. It was more than good. And this is the bit that struck me. The story itself was what needed translating. And I don't know, that felt like almost kind of meta commentary on what you were doing there. Like the story itself is the thing that us, the reader, needs to kind of translate, compute, and sort of make some sense of.
Very true.
What do you think?
And also, quietly, it's a recipe for how I write.
That's what I thought as well. It did make me think, this style of writing seems familiar to me.
Yeah. I have to say that I've stolen that from the world. It reminds me of all sorts of kinds of advertising copy and political speech, which when you listen to it, the English is perfect, but you haven't got a clue what they're talking about.
Yeah.
The world is like, I think writing should reflect the world, and I do think the world is like that. We live in a linguistic world, whether we like it or not. And most of what goes on in that world is rubbish, frankly. Linguistically, it's rubbish.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. We're getting a lot of questions now coming up in the Q&A bit, which we'll move on to in just a second. I mean, I just had one final question from me. Really, is something that I've always responded to very strongly in your work. Is like just what feels to me like the importance of like specific places to you. I mean, you are writing about fantastic places that may or may not exist, but again, there's this kind of rootedness in you might be talking about a shabby part of Camden in the Inncalling, or a cafe in Greater Manchester in Young Man's Journey to Viraconium. And these are elements that always struck me very, very much. Or the East, where there's lots of descriptions of things I like as well, like kind of the car park outside a sort of retail chain store, but after hours, and these very specific locations, banal locations. I just wondered why that was.
When I started, I was a strong Ballardian. I'd also read a whole lot of English place writing from the 20s and 30s. Huge amount of travel writing from the 20s and 30s. More non-fiction about place than fiction. Because I felt in my own heart from being a child that, as it were, character comes up out of the landscape.
Yeah.
The great thing about an early Ballard story is that you can feel the character coming up out of the landscape, out of the dunes. You read, if you read really good place writing, you can feel the personality of landscapes. And it's the same with really good urban place writing. You can feel the streets. You can feel the weight of life that's being lived in the streets.
Yeah.
And it's been more important for me to convey that. If you to ask me what my stories are about, that is one of the things they're about. That is the subject matter. That is the content. That's what I'm writing about. I'm writing about how we are so completely immersed in place that it's impossible to tell the character from the place. It's impossible to separate the event from the place in which it occurs, and so on and so forth. I feel this quite strongly because I often get accused of being a writer's writer who's very good but has no subject matter. This is not true. You need to be looking at the stories for the subject matter they actually have, not the subject matter you expect them to have.
Absolutely, and I think it goes back to that the idea of autotelio is the story is what it is, and that's what it's about. And that's something I think, especially rereading some of your work, came across very, very strongly. It's like this piece of detail of someone drinking the cup of tea in the cafe. That is part of the story. It's not incidental detail.
No, that is the attempt to celebrate being here, and that's surely what writing is about. If it's not about that, if fiction is not about that, then frankly, I'm just not interested in it. I don't have the interest.
Okay. So it's 10 to 8. We can run a bit past 8 o'clock, but we're getting a lot of questions now in the Q&A panel. So I suppose it's fair to run through them chronologically. So we've got the first one from Bob Millington. So it says, Mike, you once mentioned you're in a constant working relationship with your older material. What themes would you say have been broadly applicable that you find yourself revisiting or updating?
Well, we've just been through one of them, landscape and our relationship to it, various kinds of metaphysics, an obsession with epistemology, a slightly lesser obsession with ontology. I'm obviously very concerned about and with alienation under late capital. All of my characters reflect the attempt to live in a situation which seems to me to be very, very difficult to live in. All of those things come up again and again, and they are tied to typical images. But those images, like the Causeway or the giant insect or whatever the image is in the story, those are not the subject matter of the story. Those are just the metaphors. The real subject matter is the epistemology of the central character, the failure of explanations for the central character, the alienation of the second. Those are the subjects of the stories.
Okay, we've got another question. It says, James Elroy said that the rhythm of his prose had been influenced by bebop. Has music ever influenced your writing? Do you ever think of it in musical terms?
I don't think of it consciously in musical terms, but from the age of 20 to about the age of 60, I never wrote without headphones on and absolute rock and roll blasting into my ears. I have to say, people would say, how can you write with that noise? Any kind of lyrical content, any kind of, whether it's somebody else's prose or somebody else's poetry, or whether I'm steeped in it. I was steeped in it till about 60, and then my ears started to go, and I couldn't play the music loud enough, basically. So yes is the answer to that question. Yes.
That's great to hear. I mean, I love listening to loud music whilst I'm writing as well. So I think people think it's a thing that people can't do or don't do, but they definitely do. Okay, next question. We've got one from Sean. He's saying, what writers do you read? Do you read any contemporary sci-fi, fantasy and horror?
Very little now. I feel as if my relationship to that kind of material is now sort of internal. So I tend to read outside SF and fantasy.
What kind of stuff would you read? Would you be reading now, for example?
Well, at the moment I'm reading, let's have a look at the pile. I've got Mariana Enrique's new collection of short stories. You might call those horror. I've got a Will Eaves. I've just finished about my fourth reread of a Joan Didion collection. I tend to read more non-fiction if I can, and I tend to read memoir, especially literary memoir. I like really good writing about things.
Yeah.
I would read Didion, for instance, simply because she knows how to do a sentence. She really does know how to do a sentence. And
that kind of quality of the prose is very important to you now.
Well, yeah, not just because of the quality of the prose, but because, as far as I'm concerned, prose doesn't work unless it works. It's as simple as that. You don't use words for no reason. You don't.
That's true. Yeah.
You don't use writing as your means of communication for no reason. Basically, it's got to work for me now. It's terrible. It does reduce.
I think like, you probably earned the right for that.
Well, maybe.
It's okay to read what you like. I think.
Well, I'll do it anyway, whether I've earned it or not. So.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, we've got another question. This is related to the story you read from Lily Hunter, is asking, I'm mainly familiar with Palinurus the Navigator from Cyril Connolly's book, The Unquiet Grave. Not a book I'm aware of. Does Palinurus have a special significance for you?
Less for that book, although I read it and know it, than for his origin in myth and in the Aeneid. I was fascinated by the image of a guy who falls overboard, and ends up in the underworld, not dead, not able to navigate. I have a feeling. One of the things that fascinates me, talking about themes and repeating themes, one of my late repeating themes is being lost and found, losing objects, being lost yourself, losing things and people. And I was fascinated by the idea of a man who falls overboard and is rescued, but is somehow not rescued. That finding himself or being found doesn't solve the problem, as it were, of being a failed navigator. Yeah.
Okay. Another question so this is about your novel Climbers. Question is, Climbers seems now like an early example of autofiction, which I suppose is quite a popular genre. Like autofiction's a kind of marketing genre now. Would you say that Climbers is closer to being postmodernist or a work of autofiction? And has the rise of autofiction as a genre made you reassess the novel?
It made me think exactly that. It made me think, oh, blimey, I've already done that. It had a different name in the 70s. I forget what it was called. What did we call it? Faction. We called it Faction, as opposed to fiction, to give the idea that the two were combined. And it was intended to be exactly like that. As I said earlier, I've been reading a huge amount of travel writing, memoirs of travelers, memoirs obviously of climbers, rock climbers, mountaineers, and also a lot of fiction and semi-fiction of the type that Christopher Isherwood wrote. And I was fascinated by Isherwood's guilt over the fact that he had mixed the two up. And he wrote an entire book in the early 50s, kind of apologizing for writing Goodbye to Berlin, which is like, well, why would you do that?
Right.
And I thought one of the things I would do with my climbing book, this was before I'd even started it, was to dive straight into that, was to dive straight into the contradiction between fiction and non-fiction. the fictionalization of experience, the reportage of experiential events, which are in themselves fictions, you know, and so on and so forth. And that I would try to make that as complex a weave along the contour between fiction and non-fiction of certain types, you know, that I possibly could. And so, you know, yeah, I'm glad it's got a name now.
Yeah, so I'm sure it'll get called something different again in another 20, 30 years.
Yeah, it's there, and we should celebrate it, you know. I think I'm writing another non-fiction book at the moment, but it falls into fiction whenever I want it to, you know, and it will do. And if some editor asks me to take that out, I'll tell them to bugger off.
Good. Okay, let's carry on with the questions. How do you organise your time/working schedule in terms of the short stories and novels? Do you write the short stories between the longer works? Do they work like sketches? So I suppose the question there is, are you writing a novel and writing short stories around them, or do you work on a collection as a project in itself?
The only collection I worked on as a project was You Should Come With Me Now. It had a notion behind it. It had an idea behind it. It had an armature, as it were. It's more complicated than that because it's difficult for me to make a distinction between a short story and part of a novel. It's really difficult for me not to see a novel inside a short story. It's really difficult for me not to tap a thing and find it will fall into the fragments that make it, and that out of each of those fragments you can make something else. That's the way I live with what I do. I was going to say it's all just words. In a sense it is. It's all just bits of a structure. And you can, if you're in the right mood, you can top and tail 6 paragraphs out of a novel and make it into a short story just like that. If you're bored with the novel you're writing, you can entertain yourself by dropping your latest short story into it as a chapter, and make it stick, and be honest about that, and try and genuinely make it stick. So there's a seamless, you know, run through. You can, to me, this relationship between the short story and the novel, or between, say, flash fiction and the short story, the same relationship is made there. It's as if teeny little bits don't seem to have we don't allow them the kind of life that something slightly bigger would have. And then something slightly bigger at about 2,000 words, we don't allow that to have the life of a novel. And it's very weird. And it's very economically based. The novel is the economic solidity of commercial fiction. Novels count because you can sell them and everybody makes money. Short stories you can't sell, so they have less weight, literally, and they're passed off as being without, not without merit, but without the kind of solid merit that a novel has. And I think that's rubbish, basically.
Yeah, I would agree with you. So, I mean, at least a couple of your novels, I think, at least started in short story form. I know Course of the Heart starts as your story, The Great God Pan, doesn't it? Was that, I presume that was published first, and then that's a good example. Like, did you think I want to develop this story more, or did you think I want to take a bit out of the novel and do it as a short story?
It didn't work like that at all. You see, this is the problem. Yeah. It didn't work like that at all. There was an earlier version of Course of the Heart, which was much bigger, much longer, which had a whole. It was a generational novel. It had 3 generations of characters, and 3 generations of deaths and empresses and so on and so forth. And I looked at it one day and I thought, this isn't going to work, partly because I don't do this. This is not what I do. And so I ripped it apart. And what fell out of it was the short story, what we now know as the short story. And out of the short story, I then manufactured the novel. So it's a very complex piece of relationship. This is the point I'm trying to make, that the relationship between a short story and a novel is often not what you think it is at all. Everything is just writing. Everything is totally plastic. You tap a piece, it falls apart into its components. You tap it tomorrow, it'll fall apart into different components. You can make use of them all because fiction is fiction and writing is writing, and that's your job, you know?
Perfect. What a great answer. Okay, let's Karen, I think we've gotten to about 8:30, everyone, so we can take lots of questions. You stressed politics, the politics of your writing earlier. What politics do you think will guarantee people the kind of cognitive liberty that is demonstrated in your writing?
Blimey. I'm not sure I can answer that. I'm not sure I even quite understand it, to be honest.
I suppose it's saying your writing displays, or the people in your writing have a kind of cognitive liberty, I suppose, an imaginative allowance.
I'm not sure many of them do. You know, I feel slightly astonished at that as a comment, because I've just finished a novel in which the two main characters have no cognitive liberty whatsoever. They're completely limited by their episteme. They fail to notice a revolution going on around them because their episteme is so bounding. They are so bound by it that they can't use it to understand the world as the world is. They can't see the what do the ecologists call it? The hyper object. They can't see it. They can't see the elephant in the room. So I don't think that they are liberated. I think that I tend to write about people who are trapped in very claustrophobic circumstances, intellectually and cognitively.
Okay. Well, that mention of the hyperobject takes us on nicely, I think, to a kind of next question. The question is, you recently said that fiction should be replaced with journalism or something like this. And is this a response to, quote, the death of the novel, or the forthcoming, quote, death of civilization, which we might suggest is the hyperobject that we're all ignoring?
This stemmed from my rant, my ecological rant. What I was trying to get over by saying that was that essentially, if you've spent 50 years of your life being Cassandra, and then it all comes true, what do you do next? If as a writer you can't be a prophet anymore, if you especially can't prophesy with warnings, which is what science fiction writers have tended to do for the last 50 years, especially in that context, what do you do next? What do you do when everything has become so evident that the disaster is literally lapping around your feet, you know, as a raised sea level? What is the position of that kind of writer? In a way, it was a cri de coeur. It was kind of like, help me, someone, what do I do next? And the only thing I could think of was that you could return to what I often do, which is simply to write down what you see. You know, that the more determined to honestly write down what you can see in front of you in circumstances like this, the better. Because then what you're passing on to the reader is I wouldn't say it was the truth, but at least it gives you common ground. We can see things around us happening. But having said that, you know, I was then amused to find that I had described journalism, not writing fiction, which leaves all of us fiction writers still in the same problem. I was talking to Bill Gibson about this earlier in the year. You know, What do we do next? I don't want to be a journalist. That's not my trade. I'm a writer of fiction. I don't want fiction to become journalism. And yet I can't see any other way out at the moment, you know.
I suppose the difference is you're asking fiction to sort of, I suppose, almost honestly record what people are seeing. And a lot of people might suggest that modern journalism has strayed from that. That imperative of doing that, and it's morphed into something else, you know. So maybe you'll see the two things switch in some strange way. That's an interesting conundrum, isn't it?
It is.
What does the prophet do once their sort of prophecies have all come true?
Yeah,
and they're still here. That's an interesting one. I don't know.
I think, you know, I think writers like James Bradley they are the writers I admire in this context now. James Bradley plays it as it lays. He tells it as he sees it. He is deeply invested in trying to understand what's going on and to tell people about it. The same is true of Rob Macfarlane. The same is true of Kim Stanley Robinson. All these guys, they have had at least 10 years experience, all of them, if not more, of trying to convert our situation into readable material that will simultaneously make people aware of what's going on and change their minds and give them ideas about what might be done. I'm sorry to say that I might not be that kind of writer, you know, and I feel very sad about it.
Well, you can't do everything, Mike. You can't do everything.
No. I'd be rubbish at it anyway.
But I mean, I admire those writers. James Bradley wrote Clade, isn't it? That's the novel he wrote.
Yeah.
Okay, let's carry on. Which writer have you been most influenced by, if that's possible to answer?
It is almost impossible to answer. I think I'm not sure about the term influence anyway. I'm not massively keen on the whole concept of influence.
Why is that? Why is that?
Well, partly because I think it's a misunderstanding of what actually happens in writers' lives, except in the most obvious cases, which were covered by Harold Bloom, you know, in the 70s. Again, influence is a much more complicated thing than anybody thinks it is. Also, secondly, we read so much. If you were to ask me who I liked now, who influenced me now, I would have to sit down and spend a morning going through it and cutting the list down from about 150 people to like 3.
Yeah.
And I haven't got time to do that, really.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I also think a lot of influences are often, I don't know, they're often subconscious as well. We don't always know what's
exactly
influencing us.
I think what's more interesting is this idea of praetor sources that they had in the Victorian period, where they talked very much about the things that had influenced you so deeply in childhood that you'd forgotten them, that they had internalized so far down that you couldn't tell them from yourself anymore. And I think that's fascinating. I want them to speak, you know. I want to be the conduit for those voices.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So this question, I think we covered a lot of it in what we discussed, but what it says is, what bothers me about much sci-fi is that it transplants always the same standard narratives into different worlds. However, the sunken land begins to rise again is very different. It makes ultimately normal constellations appear increasingly weird. Could you tell us more about how you find this weirdness in the banal? So kind of what we were talking about earlier, but I mean, yeah, could you expand maybe a bit on that, of this, the weirdness of the banal in the banal?
A lot of that is technical.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's really easy to make fantasy out of non-fantasy. It's really easy, especially to make the weird out of something which is ordinary. All you need to do is to chop up the ordinary and kind of slightly redistribute it. And I think you'll find that that's what Robert Aikman does. Essentially, if you read Aikman, you realize that essentially all he has done is to rearrange bits of reality and put them into such an order that they leave you slightly curdled as you read. And you think, what? What's going on here? And I've been trying to do that since I started to read horror fiction when I was 14 or 15, because horror fiction always did that to me. The best horror fiction seemed to be made out of bits of reality that had simply been switched around a bit. So they kind of operated in a way that you didn't expect. And so again, so that your episteme was not useful in the circumstances that you were left, unable to quite decode what it was you were looking at or seeing. That fits to me with the whole concept of being in an alienated condition. And so it brings together both the subject matter and the techniques that I like to use to write. It locks them together quite solidly. And the sunken land is almost completely that. There's very little in it that's totally fantastic, if you look at it. There's a section towards the end where I spent, I think, 4 or 5 days making fish tank furniture as strange as I possibly could. The idea of looking into an aquarium and seeing these out of scale bits and pieces in strangely vibrant colours, backlit, bubbles, all of that. It seemed to me the most alien environment I'd ever looked at. And I was only looking at catalogues on the internet of things that you could put in fish tanks. It's like Chesterton used to say, basically fantasy is the way you look at the world. Basically, it's how you look at the real world.
Yeah.
So I can only say that. That's what I do. I just look at the real world and I hope that the fantasy will fall out of it. This is why I don't actually like fantasy.
No.
I don't actually like fantasy. I didn't, Viriconium was the last fantasy I ever did in that sense, where you went to a magic land and people chopped one another's heads off with swords, and mysterious things happened in front of you. It's a kind of, that has to be done with a kind of false realism. You have to convince the reader that this is happening in front of them, that the dragon is really real, that the hero is in real danger. It's like mimesis. It's like Victorian fiction. It's like mimetic mainstream literary fiction in which you attempt to convince the reader that the world that they're inhabiting as they read is a real world. Whereas, of course, actually it isn't. And why would you bother to do that? The ordinary, however, is pretty weird. Look at a bird. So
you would say that you do find the ordinary has a sense of strangeness to it.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think you can avoid it. And I also think that probably we've evolved to question the world. in that particular way. I think it's the result of going, I'm not sure I like the look of this field. I think I'll go round it, not through it. You know, I don't know why, but, you know, I haven't seen Alf recently, and he went across this.
Okay. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'll try and get through as many questions as possible, but we've got lots of very interested people. Where did we get to? Okay, here's one about you. I think you mentioned this story earlier, the story Running Down. So I wanted to ask about the development of Lyle in Running Down. He's such a horrible, infuriating character, also fascinating. I want to figure out what makes him tick. So the question is, what about the development of Lyle in the story Running Down?
He was based on about 3 people that I knew. I took characteristics from all 3 of them, the most irritating characteristics I could find. And I just ran them together, basically. All those early characters in the stories that I began to write around that time, around the time of Running Down. They were the first characters that I produced by actually observing from life. So he was a construct from real people. I find the narrator, reading it again, I find the narrator more offensive than Lyle, actually. I think the narrator needs a good talking to.
Yeah.
You know?
I suppose the character of Lyle sort of reminds me of like characters we see later on, like I've forgotten the name of the character, but in the Incalling, the guy who's ill and who performs the ritual. But I almost dislike the narrator and the guy who sort of tells his story as much as him, in the same way as you're talking about Lyle and the narrator.
My whole idea with those narrators and that whole kind of tradition of mine of those kinds of narrators, which went on for about 30 years, was to get the reader to see that the narrator was actually worse than his friend. and that essentially the narrator's position was in, if you were giving him the benefit of the doubt, you would say it was in unconscious bad faith.
Yeah.
That essentially he didn't like his friend very much. And that he wasn't admitting that to himself, for instance. I liked that relationship. I don't think you can see any of those stories without seeing that as a complex. Those 2 characters, they don't work without one another.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, another one. Has Surrealism played any part in your writing?
In as much as I chanced across Surrealism at the age of, I don't know, 17, the way you do, and was gobsmacked by it, yes. In any direct sense, no. And it's visual surrealism that would have had the impact on me, not writerly surrealism. Surrealist writing has always bored me rigid. It doesn't seem to be, it's not sufficiently under control to interest me.
So you find it too, that's an interesting thing you say, you find it too out of control?
Not too out of control, it's just that I find the product of that kind of, say, automatic writing, for instance, I find the product boring. I don't find it very interesting. You look at Burroughs, that's not automatic writing. That's some really clever technical stuff that's been applied, you know, and you look at it and you think, wow. And you understand it. You know what he's saying, even when you don't know what he's saying, you know what he's saying. The same goes for Joyce, actually. You know, you would never in your right mind call James Joyce a surrealist. He's weird, but he's not a surrealist.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, maybe that sort of the temptation for that kind of writing would be, I don't know, to let the writing become a bit baggy and not pay as careful attention to the prose. I don't know.
Well, you can do that. I mean, you can do that as part of the process. But for me, what interests me as a reader and what interests me as a writer is the is the work that's being done to pack the surface, to pack the prose with meaning. Basically, that seems to me to be the job, to pack the prose with meaning. You might produce something that looks like surrealism when you've finished, but that should be a kind of byproduct of the effort you've put into to actually so stuff your material with meaning that it falls over.
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes left, so apologies to everyone who was not able to have their question answered, but we'll end on this one. So you talked earlier, Mike, about kind of stripping the horror out of a horror story. So this question is, can you talk a bit more about your obviously complex relationship with genre? I'm sure you've been asked this one many times, but it is an interesting thing to discuss. So it says, you've talked about writing a horror story with the horror stripped out and deliberately frustrating the escapist desire of fantasy, as we were just talking about. But you use genre a lot, and you bounce off genre forms and registers, mixing them together and so on. So what is genre? What is a genre to you? Is it a prison or a tool? Because I suppose the question would be, if you dislike fantasy or things like that, why bother engaging with it at all? Is it a prison or a tool?
This is a question I asked myself when I was about 30. Why engage? And I promptly stopped engaging. At least for a while I went off and did something else. In fact, that was an extension of another question which I was asking myself at the time, which is, why write? Why engage with writing? Why don't you just go off and have a life, mate? So for a bit, I went off and had a life. It was part of, for me, genre is mixed up with the whole question of why you do what you do. But I would say now that what interests me, what genre can do for me is produce collisions for a start. And like any sort of particle accelerator, those collisions can tell me things about what I'm doing, what writing is, and so on and so forth. But also, Lawrence Durrell talked about taking the form out of his novel and leaving only the ruins. And that's what I've been trying to do with science fiction, particularly in the Kefahuchi track novels, was to take the form out and leave only its ruins, leave only the broken bits. And what fascinated me about that process was they then haunt the novel.
Yeah.
And
the bits you've removed, like you said in the sort of horror story, are still, their presence is still felt in some way, isn't it? Like, kind of haunt.
And you can then play that like becomes an instrument that you can play. I've done it with horror. I've done it with a couple of other genres, but I've never seriously tried to do it with science fiction. It's easier to do with horror because horror is quite close to realism. It really is quite close to realism. It has to be to work. I'd never done it successfully with science fiction, and I suddenly got hauntology. I was writing, Light or one of those books, and I suddenly thought, oh, I get hauntology now. I get it. I get what they're talking about. They're talking about it in another context, but I see what they're talking about. And from then on, I thought, well, from now on, my books will be haunted, all of them. They will be totally haunted. And the Sunken Land is possibly the best example of that I've managed to produce, I think. You know, it's haunted by a science fiction story. It's haunted by a ghost, by a horror, 2 or 3 horror stories. And they're all in the text, and they're all mixed up with the politics and the philosophy and the way the text constructs itself.
I think you make that quite clear in some of your books. I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, the subtitle of Empty Spaces are haunting, isn't it? And then You Should Come With Me Now, it says stories of ghosts. Yeah. So I don't think you're trying to hide your intent there. And I think if people...
Oh no, there's been no intent. I mean, what I would like to do now is to push that as far as it will go. I don't know whether I'll end up with a completely mainstream book as a result, or whether something completely new will arrive. But it seems to me that that's just such a great thing to do. It's fun. Yeah. People enjoy it. So
keep doing it. Okay, as we're coming up to 8:30, I think we'll have to wrap up there, Mike. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's attended this Zoom event. It was my first live Zoom event. I don't know if it was yours, Mike, but it's been really, really fun chatting. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to Christina at Housmans, Becca at Common Press, and Jordan at Influx for helping organise this event. It's been really, really fun. And I think we could chat for hours more about these kind of things. And hopefully we'll get to do it again, maybe in person at some point. So yeah, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.